My favorite sweeteners would be raw, just like very, very light colored honey. That's my favorite. I think I love the flavor of honey, but you don't want to overpower it. Maple sugar, pure maple sugar has been one of my favorite kind of new finds in the last couple years.
For listeners who are unfamiliar with autoimmunity, I mean, just at a 30,000 foot level, like what is it?
Yeah,
What is
yeah.
autoimmunity?
Yeah, the way I like to describe it, and again, I'm not a doctor or scientist, but I've been living with this for 12 years, or 13 years. Autoimmune diseases are when your immune system is overactive and they attack an otherwise healthy organ that doesn't need to be attacked. It's kind of the way that I'm like, that's the easiest way to explain it to me. So for me, it's my colon, there are white blood cells in there that are causing inflammation and it's trying to fight something off that's not present. People can have, psoriasis and it can attack their skin, MS. There's I think 180, 200 or so known autoimmune diseases. Then there's things like lupus that actually can affect your entire body. But essentially, that's the way that I've come to understand it.
Wow, it's amazing that you, as you mentioned, you visited all these doctors and they gave to you basically what I've come to call diagnose and adios. They were just like,
Yeah.
here, take these drugs. There's this incredible meme. I don't know if you've seen it circulating on social media, but it's like there's a woman sitting on the, I don't know what it's called, but like the bench in the doctor's office, and she looks really unhappy, and she's got like spots all over her face, and she clearly, like, the cartoonist drew her to depict how miserable she was feeling, and the quote
Right.
underneath, there's a doctor looking at her, and the doctor's like, well, all your labs look normal, looks like you're okay,
Right.
you know.
Right.
But I mean, so often there are these underlying latent conditions going on, and it really takes becoming your own health investigator, like what you've done,
Yeah.
to get
Yeah.
to the root cause. So I just want to
Right.
like applaud you in your journey.
Well, thank you. It's when you feel that helpless and hopeless at that point, I think a lot of times it is hard for people to want to push through because it's just so much to think about and you don't know the right questions to ask and you don't know the right tests to request, and that's like something that you hope and expect your doctor to guide you towards. And I definitely had those frustrating. I mean, it took, multiple specialists to finally even get tests and then to be diagnosed. And then even after diagnosis, yeah, I mean, I was sent out the door after a week-long hospital stay of, this is what you have. It's uncurable. You'll have it for life, but just take this. And that was kind of it. They never actually even told me about autoimmunity. They didn't mention those, like that it was an autoimmune disease. They just, kind of sent me out and we asked why and, how. And that was just kind of like, well, we don't really know, and that was pretty much all the answers we got. So I had to take it into my own hands. It's also just the kind of person I am. But I just had to keep searching and researching and trying to learn about it on my own.
I love that. I can totally relate. So you mentioned that you started scouring these online message boards back in 2007, and you stumbled upon this like grain-free, dairy-free lifestyle. When you first saw
Yeah.
that mentioned, I mean, like what was going through your head? Because grains, because like growing up in the 80s and 90s, grains I thought were this amazing thing that you've got to eat 7 times a day, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
so like what
Yeah,
was
it's
your
definitely what we were taught.
yeah.
You know what? To be quite honest with you, I remember being like, I don't even know what a grain is. Yes, like I always heard whole grain is most, it's the healthiest and you're supposed to eat it all the time. And we got rid of like the Wonder Bread and started eating whole grain bread and that type of thing. But if you could have asked me to list the actual foods that were grains, had no idea. So it was a massive learning curve for me. So I think when I first saw it, it probably didn't hit me just how much stuff I was going to have to cut out. It was more of just like, okay, well, this is working. Let's try to give it a shot. But when I really started flipping the ingredient list and looking and like, oh, wow, everything that I'm eating has, grains in it or dairy or soy or corn or, things like that. That was really the kind of eye-opening moment of like, okay, there's a lot we have to change here. And there's a lot I have to, go through and just completely like revamp my kitchen, revamp my pantry. And then on the other side of things, I didn't know how to cook, any other way. I mean, I was pretty young as it was and didn't do a whole lot of cooking in college, but anything I did know how to make came from my mom, my grandma, and it all used grains. So it was, it was a fairly big shift. And it took me a long time. I might always like to say that because I think it's a mental thing for people, I mean, you're grieving your diagnosis and you're grieving all of these foods. And then you're just in this kind of deer in headlights kind of time for a little while where you're just like, I don't even know what to do. It's just so much. And then there's this commitment that you have to make, and that was mentally really hard for me. I'd commit and then I'd fall off and I'd go back and, and I wouldn't see the improvement that I wanted at first, but that's because maybe I was doing 5 days of doing well, but then I'd, go and eat whatever I wanted on the weekends. And so my body just wasn't even having time to recover. So it was a good few years before I really set, my mind to it and was like, no going back. This is it. This is the only way that I can live a full and happy life.
Did you, was there any point at which you grieved grains?
Oh yeah. I mean, grains, dairy, all of it. Yeah. I loved a baguette with cheese. Like I loved a good bowl of oatmeal in the morning. So yeah, there was a long period of time. I'm also like, I'm known now for my baked goods. And it's just, I grieved the celebratory things like, getting to throw a party for family and friends and having a cake or a pie or something like that. Or, it had been another wave when I had started having kids. I have 3 kids and I, went through this kind of wave at the beginning of my first son. He's 10 now, but just this feeling of like, oh, like moms are supposed to be able to make cookies with their kids and sit and enjoy them, or like there's a birthday party at school and I really want him to not feel left out. And so there were multiple kind of times where I grieved the foods that I couldn't have. And that's really what set me on the path of starting to create my own recipes, because I just was like, I refuse to be this young and live the rest of my life feeling like I'm missing out on all of the things that are important to me and the traditions and the like nostalgic times that I remember as a child.
Yeah. I mean, looking over your Instagram, it doesn't look like you're missing out on anything. It's just so, it's just so funny. Like like growing up, like every meal had to have a grain for me,
Right,
like it was either like a sandwich or a wrap or a brown rice bowl or whole wheat pasta. I remember being such a huge fan. I couldn't envision life without grains. But now it's funny, like not only do I never think about grains, I can't really envision life with them, or at least with them taking up the kind of real estate on my plate that they used to take up.
That's what I was going to say. They definitely took up. I mean, I was going to say the same word with real estate. It's like, I feel like that was the majority of what filled us up as kids. It was like a teeny portion of vegetables, if any, a little bit of meat, and then whatever it was, that big starch, on the side. And I always say, when I first started eating this way, paleo was very big. And that's the word that was used a lot just because it classified my recipes. And there was this, kind of caricature at the time going around with like a person just eating this like massive turkey leg, and that's kind of what people thought, that it was just all meat heavy all the time. And I always said I eat more vegetables now than I did before, because there's more space on my plate that I can fill, and I also realized just how nutrient dense and healthy they are and how great they are for my body. But I'm like, cutting out the grains didn't mean for me adding more meat necessarily or other things to fill that in. It was like, oh wow, I actually have expanded my view to eating and filling up more on vegetables.
Yeah, love that. Speaking of vegetables, so in your own personal health journey, there's a lot of talk these days about lectins, inducing what's called molecular mimicry, aggravating people's immune systems when they have active autoimmunity. So have you found that there are any vegetables that you seem to do better, without, or like what's your current diet look like these days?
So the only thing that I found, and it just depends if I'm symptomatic, which this has not been a perfect journey. I actually had a really bad setback last year, but I've done incredibly well considering and compared to what I used to be. But when I'm symptomatic, vegetables are hard if they're not cooked, and that's pretty standard for anybody with a digestive disease, especially things like leafy greens and things like that. But otherwise, the only one that I don't do a lot of, or I don't really do at all, are white potatoes. And it kind of depends. I can do some nightshades, if they're cooked. I don't do a ton of tomatoes. But the lectin thing I think is interesting. I've been really trying to study and learn kind of over the last couple of years. It's fairly new, all things considered, with my full journey from 2007. But I haven't found it to be super detrimental for me, just in terms of like the seeds in a cucumber or things like that. But I do think there's something to it. And I think everybody's bodies are different. That's what I found. I think there's this kind of good baseline, but then there might be nuanced things here and there. But yeah, really just raw stuff when I'm not feeling well. And then white potatoes just don't do well for me. They can cause inflammation and I get bloated and my joints can hurt and I just kind of stay away from them.
Oh man. Yeah, I didn't I mean I didn't want it to sound like I was endorsing like removing lectins or anything like that. But
Yeah.
it's just been interesting because a lot of people today, whether it's, sort of a more well, I guess like Gundry-esque approach, who have cut the lectins
Right.
out
Yeah.
or have gone full-blown carnivore. It just seems that, some
Mm.
people with active autoimmunity, like it's not just the removal of grains that bring on a reprieve
Right.
of symptoms. It's a more extreme version of that. So I was just wondering if you sort of
Yeah.
dabbled in any of those more extreme dietary patterns.
No, I haven't. Aside from paleo, or occasionally I kind of revert to like an autoimmune protocol when I'm not feeling well, which cuts out the nuts, the seeds, the nightshades. So that definitely is a little bit more extreme. But I found that I don't have to do that all the time, which I'm grateful for. It's really just in order to kind of get symptoms at bay. But really, for me, it's grain and dairy free, no refined sugars, no legumes. But in addition to that, I found and really learned the hard way over the last few years that I actually really have to take care of my body as a whole. I have to make sure that I'm prioritizing rest. I have to make sure I'm prioritizing not being stressed and anxiety and all of those things. And they really kind of go hand in hand with the way that I eat.
Stress is massive. I mean, a
It's
stressful
huge.
event can cause a flare up, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think I knew that, but I didn't really take it seriously. And that's what put me into such a bad setback last year. I just didn't have the boundaries that I needed to and ran myself into the ground no matter how well I was eating. So I've learned my lesson, but I'm sure I'll probably, stumble again at some point.
Man, well, glad you're on the mend. So how did you then come to start your blog against all grain?
Yeah, so I started my blog in 2009, I believe. I might have started in 2008, but I didn't really much on it. I was starting to get into the kitchen and create recipes. Again, it was like there might have been one or two blogs at that point. I don't think were any cookbooks, maybe very shortly thereafter. And so I just felt at a loss. I felt like the food I was eating was cardboard, and I just felt very deprived and was like, this is not the life I want. I grew up in a very large Italian family that hosted big. My grandmother still to this day, 86 years old, and still hosts our family, not right now, sadly, but and 30, 40 people at a time. And that was the way she showed her love, was through food. And that was really kind of how I felt too. I wanted to bring people around my table to create community around food. And I couldn't eat the chicken and steamed broccoli for the rest of my life. So I started getting into the kitchen and just recreating a lot of things that I grew up eating, like substituting out things for the regular dinner, recipes that I grew up eating. And then got into the baked goods. And my husband was the one who suggested starting a blog. He just was like, you should start a blog. And so he set me up with the WordPress, and I just started snapping photos of the things I was creating with my phone, and I was sharing the recipes with neighbors and coworkers, and they were all giving good feedback on them, and they were all asked for the recipes. And so I was like, well, it's an easier way to just type it up and put it up there and they can use it, and I don't have to hand it out to multiple people. And it was also just a way to kind of catalog my journey, and then eventually became a way to connect with other people who were suffering like I was. When I first started it, I just figured it would be like my grandma, my mom, and my sister that were reading it. But I started a Facebook page, I think around 2011, and started publishing the recipes there, and just started seeing it grow and grow. And I think probably the biggest thing that I noticed were people were feeling the same. They just like really wanted to be able to enjoy those pastimes, especially other parents and things like that. But that also they just needed to find somebody who knew what they were going through. And that's what I felt like I needed too. I didn't have anybody in my life that was walking the same journey of going through an autoimmune disease. And so I think we just kind of formed this community and this bond, which I've been so grateful for over the years. But yeah, that's kind of how it started. It started with just me in the kitchen, just experimenting.
It's so cool. And so that kind of blossomed into these 4 cookbooks that you've written at this point.
Yeah, it did. So about a year or so after I started the blog, I got a call from a publisher, and they offered me a deal. And the story I thought was cool was because the woman who worked there, son had an autoimmune disease, and he was young, and he went to a school where they had cereal day every week. and he couldn't do grains and he felt super left out. And I have this granola recipe that's like soaked in sprouted nuts that are dehydrated and sweetened with honey. And so she would make that for him and send it with almond milk or something like that, or coconut milk. And he felt like he could be part of the celebration every week again. And so she showed my blog to the publisher, and that's how my first book came about. And then it went on from there.
That's amazing. How do you?
Yeah,
You mentioned that you have three kids. I mean, I don't have
I
any.
do.
I don't have any kids that I know of, at least. So this is not a topic that I can speak to particularly well. But how do you balance? Like, how do you balance being a mom, having three kids around, having these dietary restrictions with
Yeah.
with kids who basically want to eat whatever is pleasurable to them?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. So for my first son, at first I just didn't realize like I was changing everything about the way I was eating, but I was still doing all the normal quote unquote things that most American parents do for their kids, like buying the, box flaked oatmeal or rice cereal that you mix up, or giving them, all the like cheese crackers, the fish crackers, just all those things that I just were like, oh, okay. And then I started moving into kind of like, okay, well, I should at least get organic versions of those. So it was a kind of a slow process. But then after time, I just realized like, if this is as important to my body as it is, and I started learning more and more about how autoimmune diseases can be hereditary. My children were also born via C-section, which can make them even more susceptible to it. And so it really became a passion of mine to make sure that I tried to prevent at all costs that they would get what I had. So my younger two have just kind of been raised on it. Like they know spaghetti squash and they know, that's like they don't know normal noodles. They do a little bit. I always say, they're 100% gluten free. 85% of the time they eat grain-free paleo kind of diet, but then I'll buy like some whole brown rice pasta for them because they can tolerate it. And it doesn't seem to bother them, but we do no artificial sugars, no artificial food dyes, everything's pretty clean. But that's partially why I became passionate about recreating the things like the cupcakes and the cookies and things, because they're going to be exposed to that kind of stuff. And it doesn't matter how much you tell a 5-year-old that it's the best for them, that they don't eat it. It's like they need to at least feel like they're part of it. And so I send, my own cupcakes to school for them, or they keep like a bag in the freezer of something of mine so that when there's a party at school, they can like pull it out. And that was very apparent early on as like even a preschooler, sending different snacks to school, and just how they as they're growing up, they're learning how to be part of society and how, to be part of the world. And it's really surprising how much food is a part of that and how you can really feel ostracized, based on how you eat. And I'm like, I felt it as an adult, so I can't even imagine a little one. So we talk a lot, about my disease. Unfortunately, they have seen me, bedridden at times here and there. They've seen me sick. And so without trying to scare them, we talk about why it's important that we eat this way and that it helps mommy stay healthy so that I can be, there for them. And I think they really understand it. Again, like they're going to be 16 and they're going to go to a friend's house and probably down like 4 boxes of mac and cheese. And it's going to happen at some point. Like I know it's going to. But the biggest thing for me is trying to help them see the correlation of how their body feels after they eat things. We've had those circumstances here and there over the years of like going to a movie with a friend and getting the candy and popcorn and coming home and feeling gross and their stomach hurts. And, I try to tell them like, hey, did you feel like that before you went to the movie and before you ate that? And so just really trying to just show them to like listen to their bodies. That's kind of the way I've tried to approach it. And they're going to make bad decisions, but my hope is that the foundation that's laid and just trying to understand from a young age that food can make you feel a certain way, but good or bad, that they'll hopefully make good decisions as they get older.
I love that. Like a gentle coaxing.
Yeah, exactly.
Is all it takes. Yeah. I ate tons of crap growing up.
I know. Same.
Tons, like McDonald's. I
Yep.
remember like just like God, Lunchables, Dunkaroos.
Oh
like
yeah.
fruit
Oh yeah,
roll-ups,
all of it.
Pop-Tarts,
We must
cereal.
have grown up around the same time because those were all the things. Yes, all of them. Pizza pockets or hot pockets. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, my mom was like the queen of frozen processed foods. And that was I feel like our generation. That's just, it's stuff we grew up on. Sometimes I poke fun at her and I'm like, you wonder why I have this disease, but it's something they couldn't, they didn't know any better. But yeah, I had the friends, I feel like we all had, especially kids who grew up in like the 90s, we all had that one friend whose mom was very like super strict. They never ate chocolate. They only ate carob, or they only ate like the whole grains, or they were never allowed this or that. And then you went to college with that friend and they like just like nosedive ate all the things. And so I'm like, my thought with raising my kids, I'm like, I'm not going to try to, I don't want to deprive them. I don't want them to go off and like try to rebel and go the other direction. I want to like bring them into it. They cook a lot with me. I want to talk with them. Like I want to, try to have them have this understanding and belief of it, that it's not just something that like I'm imposing on them.
Yeah, I love that. How do you handle eating out, going to
Oh.
restaurants?
Well, so I live in the Bay Area, so I'm pretty fortunate in that like most of the restaurants around here are really accommodating. I mean, I feel like from when I was diagnosed, especially where you would say gluten free and they'd look at you like you had like five heads, to now even understanding grain free. So, I mean, most menus these days have it listed what things can be modified or what's gluten free. Thankfully, I don't have celiac, so I can eat in a place that's cross contaminated. I'm not that sensitive to gluten, at least. But when I travel, which I do a lot for work normally, not this year, I tend to find places that I spend a lot of time on Yelp. My friends always make fun of me because I'm like looking for lunch when we're at breakfast of like, okay, where can we go that's safe? But I like to try to find places that I know have good quality, like grass-fed meats and organic, poultry and local organic vegetables. And then I know like, okay, I can probably modify something if they're like at least focusing on quality. Worst case scenario, if I'm like stuck, I'll get a salad and I'll just do olive oil and lemon juice, or I'll get a lettuce wrap burger or something if like I'm stuck and I just can't. But for the most part around here, we can eat pretty easily and we can actually really enjoy a lot of the places, which I'm super grateful for.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like California, we're so lucky living in this state, in
Yes.
many ways. Um,
Yes.
in the sense that it really is the epicenter of the healthy, holistic food movement, whatever you want
Yeah.
to call it,
Yeah.
in the U.S. And it has been that way for decades.
Right, right. And everything's so fresh too. I mean, it's like our produce and it's like we can get mostly everything year round. I mean, we're very fortunate in that way. And I mean, I think this is where like the farm to table, kind of movement originally kind of started, I feel like just with everything being local and fresh and that's such a priority. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely easier here than it is in some places in the Midwest and the South. That's for sure.
So you've talked about how you've been able to adapt some of your indulgences to your new lifestyle. All the baked goods that pepper your Instagram so beautifully. What about what's your take on alcohol and how that affects ulcerative colitis?
Yeah, so I don't do any grain-based alcohol, clearly, although I am somewhat of the mind that it's kind of not fermented, but distilled out. But still, I kind of stay away from it. I just don't know how it's going to react. I occasionally will do 100% agave tequila. I like a good margarita that's made with honey. That's like if I'm gonna do something as a drink, like I'll make something like that. I love a glass of red wine. I've over the last 5 or 6 years, I've realized that if I drink a glass that's organic and biodynamic, doesn't have any added sugars and the sulfites and the coloring, that I can tolerate it just fine. I mean, again, it's like if I'm noticing any sort of symptoms, I just stay away from any of that stuff because it does still have, natural sugars. And, but yeah, again, I'm 35 minutes from the Napa Valley. So I love a good glass of wine. But I don't, none of the sugary like cocktails or mixers or anything like that. But yeah, I think on occasion, I mean, maybe I don't even do a drink a week. I would say maybe a couple times a month I have a glass of something, but I'm not too strict on that.
Yeah, I think like in so far as alcohol has this ability to reduce stress for people,
Yeah,
that's like
right,
a
right,
non-trivial benefit of drinking alcohol, even though alcohol itself is a toxin, right? It's like
right.
we live these stressed out lifestyles, like
Right,
2020 was a stressful year.
right.
And I'm not being like, I don't think alcohol needs me to come out in its defense, but But when you have an autoimmune condition and stress can, lead to flare-ups, it's like it's nice to know
You're
that you
right.
can have like a glass of wine at the end of the day.
Right, right. And actually, yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think, I mean, I'm sure it's somewhat controversial. I do some CBD, which I think helps with stress as well. And that might be a little safer than alcohol. But yeah, I have not noticed it. I mean, I definitely hear from people with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's that alcohol or wine can really bother their systems. But when I switched to like quality wine that I knew was grown and harvested and produced in a way that wouldn't affect me, I've actually noticed a pretty significant difference.
Hmm.
So, but again, like I can't do too much. I mean, I need to, it's within moderation for me. But yes, 2020, a glass of wine at the end of the day with 3 kids at home and trying to run a business. It's definitely been a stress reliever. That's for sure.
That's awesome. When it comes to baking, what are some of your favorite, I don't know, things to make, ingredients to use? I dabble in baking.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I'm a pro by any means, but I've got some like recipes that I've gotten pretty good at
Yeah.
over time. So like,
Yeah.
what are some of your go-tos?
It depends. I used to use a ton of almond flour, which I mean, I still use here and there, but I've noticed so many people have nut allergies. I've actually noticed that if I go overboard on like the nut flours too, that I can kind of backtrack a little bit. I use coconut flour. I like arrowroot starch or arrowroot powder here and there just to kind of give something like a more kind of pliable texture and a little bit of a crunch. My favorite sweeteners would be raw, just like very, very light colored honey. That's my favorite. I think I love the flavor of honey, but you don't want to overpower it. Maple sugar, pure maple sugar has been one of my favorite kind of new finds in the last couple years. Like there are just certain things you can't get without a granulated sugar in terms of texture. And so I've loved using that. Coconut sugar, it's been great to use and that's been around for so long, but it's very dark. It's like more like brown sugar. So maple sugar has been one of my favorite things to be able to recreate like sprinkles for my kids. Like I couldn't do that before that. Or French macarons. Like there's just certain things that you can't get. But I'm trying to think what else. I do. I love to use nut butters just because they're already super smooth and you don't get that kind of like gritty, grainy texture that you can get with some of the flours. So I use that a lot, like almond butter or sunflower seed butter in muffins or in breads, things like that. I think that's kind of it. I'm like, those are like the main things in my pantry.
I like it. Well, have you not dabbled with like some of these like sugar-free, calorie-free sugar alternatives, like erythritol, monk fruit, stevia? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on those?
So 100% stevia I think is fine. I'm not a huge fan of the sugar alcohols.
Hmm.
My body doesn't tend to like them. I also just don't like the flavor.
Hmm.
I feel like they have such an interesting aftertaste. So I don't use them much. Stevia occasionally, but I kind of prefer like the regular like honey maple syrup, those types of things. And dates. I use a lot of dates. That's another sweetener that I use.
That's cool. Yeah, I don't know. I like. I'll use erythritol. Doesn't upset my stomach at all. But I know that
Yeah.
some sugar alcohols have a very pronounced, GI like distress effect.
Yeah.
But
It might be why for me. I'm like,
yeah,
again,
interesting.
I'm like, everybody's different.
Everybody's different. I don't know if you know this. This is something that I thought was very interesting. Prunes are very high in, I believe it's sorbitol, which is a sugar alcohol.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I had no idea.
Yeah, which is
Huh.
why prunes are such a well-known, they have this like well-known laxative effect.
Right.
It's
Yes, they
not
do.
because of the fiber in the prunes. It's because of that
Huh.
sugar alcohol. So if you look at and what's funny is that you'll look at like, if you go to Trader Joe's or whatever, you can find these like sugar-free chocolate bars or whatever. They're loaded
Yes.
with
They all have
sorbitol.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it's
It's
no
funny. My husband will probably be so mad at me for saying this, but I had never heard the word sorbitol until he told me that it bothered his stomach. He doesn't have any autoimmune disease, nothing, but he used to chew gum that had sorbitol in it, and he would notice like he would get very gassy. So, and that's when I first realized I was like, oh, I wonder if some of these other ones might be causing that with me. So, I mean, it's all about like trying to listen to your body and hear the different things. But yeah, I think I'm open to some of them. I think the biggest problem for me, I get a lot of fans asking like, can I substitute in stevia? Can I substitute in monk fruit? And the problem is a lot of the brands that are out there have so many extra things in them. I'm like, it's pretty difficult you have to really seek out and look at the ingredients to find like a pure monk fruit sweetener that doesn't have a bunch of other stuff in it. And same for the stevia. But yeah, I mean, I occasionally have this like powdered 100% stevia that's just like the ground leaves that I think works really well. That's probably my favorite alternative if I were to use it.
That's awesome. You mentioned that you've made sprinkles for your kids.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I have. They were for one of my books. I have a book called Eat What You Love, and the whole premise around it was just everything that you would want to eat. You can. That's, grain and dairy and refined sugar free. So yes, I made sprinkles. I was making a frosting at one point with like a royal icing that I would have, you would have used to make sugar cookies. And it's typically an egg white base that has powdered sugar in it. And that's when it kind of crisps up at the end. And so I was making a frosting. I was testing out recipes with the egg whites and with a little starch and some maple sugar. And when it dried, I was like, oh, this actually has the texture of like a sprinkle. So I started doing some, natural like food colorings with beets and with blueberries and dyeing them and piping them out. And then you just chop them up. And it's a little bit of a process, but for like your kids who just want to, they see their friends eating sprinkles on ice cream or on top of cookies or something like that. It was a fun one to kind of figure out. And I was like, oh, you can actually make sprinkles. It's not that hard.
Man, how lucky are your kids? Jesus.
Well, I mean, I'm sure they probably feel lucky and unlucky. Actually, I don't think they even appreciate it. Let's be honest. I'm like, it's just normal for them. So,
So funny. So you've got this new digital cooking course coming out.
Yes.
That I'm sure your followers are excited for. What's that about?
Yeah, it's something that I've been wanting to do for a really long time, and 2020 kind of gave me that opportunity. I obviously none of us are traveling, and that's what takes up a lot of my time. But traveling for me is a chance to connect with the people who follow me, who buy the books, who have followed the recipes, who have seen major change in their lives because of the shifts in their diet. And so I've really missed that part specifically. But then we also just really found over the years that and I was at the beginning too, a lot of people are really intimidated by cooking in a totally new lifestyle with different ingredients. And when I will make something on my Instagram and show how easy and how normal it looks, like it actually looks like good food when it comes out. We see so many more people that are willing to take the risk of trying it themselves. Like, so all of a sudden, I'll see thousands of people post the same recipe that I made the day before because it inspires them, and they see like, oh, coconut aminos, they look like soy sauce. Like at first I was worried because I didn't know what that was, but they look, like the food that I remember, or like that, that dinner looks exactly like the regular dinner that I grew up eating. And so I've really wanted to create this community of, like-minded people who have health in mind, who want to eat healthier, but might be intimidated by cooking for their family or for themselves, and that really want to learn how to cook. I mean, you can't go to culinary school. You can't watch the Food Network and see this way of cooking. And so this was kind of my way of getting to do that and really getting to be in people's kitchens with them. It's going to be a lot different than what I do on a day-to-day basis on my social media. It's like we're really cooking through the recipe together. We're not editing a 3 to 5 minute cooking video. Like we're going to show the whole, 20, 30 minute process of this. We're going to talk about the tips and tricks of what to look for in the grocery store and what something looks like, when it's almost done, and what it looks like when it's undercooked. And they just really get to see the full process. And then there's going to be a lot more in terms of like really forming a community. When I went on my book tour for my last book, what I noticed as I visited each city was that there were so many people that came out to the event alone. They drove, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and they didn't come with anybody because they didn't have anybody that was interested in it. They didn't have that support system. And so I started just to have this idea of like, gosh, wouldn't it be so cool if there's 400 people sitting in this room that obviously all care about this. Like, couldn't we connect you all where you can give each other tips, about like, oh, well, I found coconut, crystals, coconut milk at this store in this aisle, or this restaurant's really accommodating to, gluten-free or grain-free, and where people in individual places could really also kind of form a community and where they could become each other's resources and connect over that. So that's kind of the hope and the goal of all of this, is not only will they be learning to cook with me and cooking with me, but that they're also all the participants will kind of form this community together where they can really empower each other and really encourage each other and kind of inspire each other to try the recipes or to try something new or substitute something in if they can't have it. But yeah, that's kind of the hope, and really just giving people more of like an inside look at kind of my day-to-day tips and tricks that I've learned over the last 12 years of cooking this way and making it a profession, but also having 3 kids, and just like my tips on, batch cooking dinners and freezing things and just all of that. Like really a more intricate look into kind of what my real kitchen and my life looks like.
That's amazing. I'm sure that course is going to be so valuable to people who take it. I didn't know this about you prior to doing the research, on you leading up to this, to our chat. But you're a self-taught chef. You're a self-taught chef who has 4 cookbooks, 3 of which are New York Times bestsellers, which is amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
So great. I mean, so inspiring to anybody out
Thank
there
you.
listening who aspires to do something in the world of food, and chefery. But what are some things that you know now that you wish you knew about cooking back when you first started?
Oh gosh. I think, I think one of the biggest things for me was, yeah, I wasn't trained. I didn't go to school. I really never veered from a recipe. So I think probably the biggest thing for me is to take risks and to like experiment. I think people are so afraid that if they go off of a recipe at all, that it won't work and it'll flop. Baking, that's a little bit more tricky, but like for dinners, I just feel like people don't feel like they have the freedom to take a recipe and kind of make it their own. So I think that would be my biggest advice, was just to have some fun with it and to not feel like you really have to, stay within the guidelines. I mean, obviously don't change anything significant, but like swap your vegetables that you like in, or if you need to use stuff up in your fridge, do that. I think the other big thing that I've learned, especially, with trying to run a business full time and having kids, is to just really try to plan ahead. I mean, my early days, I think I had good intentions, but I would like go into the grocery store without a plan and end up with so much food at the house that I would end up wasting, 2 weeks down the road that I'd find in the fridge. And I'm like, oh, I thought I was going to use that, but I didn't. So I've really used meal planning a lot more, even if it's a little bit of a loose meal plan for me, but just that I'm buying things intentionally, that I have ideas for what to use them for. Also, like just using them up, when I see something that's about to go bad, I just really like, if I didn't have a recipe, just to like throw it into something and use it up. That's probably the other thing too. Cause it's just, I mean, eating this way is expensive for people at first, but I honestly think one of the biggest reasons why it's so costly is these people, I think there's a lot of food waste. I think it's a way to really get it down, to be more budget friendly.
Yeah, absolutely. Meal prep is such a great way to, stay on track in terms of your health goals, in terms of your budgetary goals. Any other mistakes that you'd routinely make back then? I feel like for new chefs, one of the things that I notice, for example, I'll go first, is that people tend to undersalt foods.
Oh, yes.
They tend to underseason. That's one of the major reasons why I think so many children grow up, become adults that have this aversion to vegetables, because their parents didn't make them taste good because they tasted terrible. Yeah, they tasted terrible growing up. Yeah. I was very lucky in that my mom always, made vegetables very well seasoned. She did a great job there. But any like things like that.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I totally echo you on that. That's one thing I learned over the years is you also have to season in layers. Like you season as you go because it builds on the flavors, and yeah, I like to do it as you go. But I do always say, I'm like, go as you go, and you can always add more at the end. You can't take it out. So that's the only thing I always caution people. I'm like, don't dump 2 teaspoons in at the beginning, because then you're screwed and you can't fix it. Yeah. But I utilize a ton of fresh herbs and dried spices. I think they can make any meal just to have so much more vibrancy and flavor, that might otherwise be a little bit boring. But yeah, I think too, and as a mom, like don't underestimate, your palate, and don't just turn something off because you don't think you'll like it or they'll like it. There was, one thing that I used to make all the time when my 10-year-old was 2, and it was just this really simple curry dish that with like 5 or 6 different vegetables with a little coconut milk and like 6 different dried spices. Kind of more of an Indian Thai. Well, it was like a mix between an Indian and a Thai curry, but I would always eat it at lunch and I'd give him his normal, like finger foods and things. And he took a bite of it one time and ended up downing the whole bowl. And I just thought it wasn't spicy, but it had spices. It had turmeric and it had ginger and, cumin and coriander. And I never in my, wildest dreams would have thought a 2-year-old would like that. And so after that, I really started having that, thing of like, just try a bite. And it's kind of the same for adults, like even if it's something that might be a little bit different flavor profile than what you're used to, give it a shot. Like try it one time and see, because it could really, expand what your taste buds are used to. And you might end up finding that you love it.
Spices are so great. Herb spices, that they also add like negligible calories to your food,
Right.
whereas
So
like
true.
sauces and dressings,
Yes.
you're easily loading on the oil, the sugar, and things like that. So
Yes.
great to know
Totally.
how to wield a spice in the kitchen.
Yeah. It's true.
At what
Yeah, and
age?
don't be afraid to mix them. That's the other thing too. I'm like, don't just go with one. Like mix a bunch of different ones, because that's like where the flavor bombs come from.
Interesting. What do you have any favorite combinations?
You know what? I have the weirdest combination. I have this recipe on my site that's called I call it burnt broccoli. And it's because a friend of mine, husband, he used to roast broccoli and like practically burn it, like charred roasted broccoli. And I started doing it, but adding this like lemon juice and this whole spice mix. And it's when you look at the spices, you wouldn't think that it would taste good together, but it's so good. It has cumin, coriander, cinnamon, just like a teeny bit of cinnamon, turmeric. I'm trying to think what else is in it, but that's kind of like I love coriander and cumin together for sure. And then I
Hmm.
usually kind of tried to add a couple others in there. But yeah, I definitely, those would be some of my favorites.
Love that. So important. At what age can you? Because I know you're not supposed to give, and you've gone through this 3 times, babies salt, right? But you can give them
Yeah.
like other spices are okay. And at what age can you
Yeah.
can you start to give them salt?
Yeah. Salt. Gosh, I think, I think it's okay. I think they worry about dehydration, but also that they'll like turn down any food that's not salty.
Hmm.
So I didn't salt a lot of foods, but I started putting spices in. Like for my first two, I did purees. We did like a baby led weaning for my third one, which is like where they're picking up pieces. But I would sprinkle cinnamon. I would sprinkle, all sorts of different things on their food just to get them used to all of the different flavors. Not a lot, just a little bit, but yeah, babies, they're obviously new to it, and so, but like boring bland food is not really fun for anybody. At the beginning, yes, like just the very simple things, but I think in order to get them to try things and like things and not always just want them bland, you have to start introducing it. Depends when your kids start eating, but usually after a couple months of solid foods is when I would start sprinkling different spices and seasonings in there.
What do you do if they don't want, a given food? Like what are your coercion methods?
Yeah, it depends. When they're babies and they're like newly eating, they're gonna take and pick up what they want and they're gonna put in their mouths what they want. So there's not a whole lot you can do there. I really did find with my third one with that, they call it baby led weaning. I didn't exactly follow it to a T, but serving them what we were eating was
Hmm.
huge for me. For them to see it on my plate and just to have it, being on their tray but looking slightly different, and really just giving them that kind of ownership and control over it, that there's 4 things on their tray and they can choose which one to pick up. I felt like that was super helpful. But really, I think for my kids, as they got older, for me, I think the biggest ticket to getting them to try things is getting them in the kitchen with you,
Hmm.
or getting them into the garden if you can have a small garden. Like when we first planted, we had 2 beds. It wasn't huge, just small little, like square beds, but we grew vegetables that, again, I think a lot of parents underestimate what their kids will like, and they just, buy like the standard, kid vegetables, or like, and we planted, snow peas, and we planted cucumbers, and we planted tomatoes. And I just remember watching like them planting them as a seed and then having them grow and get to pick them. They took bites right then and there in the garden because it was like, I made this. And cucumbers are now, all 3 of my kids, they walk around with like the little baby cucumbers and just eat them like an apple in my house. And I'm like, I don't think I would have bought cucumbers for my kids, honestly. Like it's not something, I always think of those being in salads, and I just don't think I would have like given them as a snack. So I think getting them involved, whether it's the growing, it's the tasting. I mean, like I have my kids smell the spices before we put them in stuff. I have them, taste things. I just think it's really helpful for them to get to see the process, whatever it is, because it's like they have this ownership over it of like, oh, I helped with that. I made that. And it also really, it sparks their curiosity, because it's like they saw it, being made, and they're like, well, I want to see what it tastes like, and they don't always like it. And that's fair. Like it's, for me, I'm like, okay, you tried it. And if they don't like it, usually what I'll do is not let them eat. They don't have to eat it, but we'll try it again, like in a few months or a year. Cause their palates, especially when they're young, are like constantly changing. I mean, one of the things I always tell parents when they're feeling like super frustrated, and they'll look at, they'll look at my kids, and I'll be like, I write cookbooks for a living, but I still have a normal, like, picky child. Like, it's part of growing up. Kids just do it. It's like them figuring out their voice, and, but they will eat. I mean, my kids would eat at 2, they'd eat salmon and they'd eat asparagus and they eat like anything I put on their plates. But then 3 weeks later, they'd be tossing it off and like completely refusing it. So they just go through cycles. And I think, just constantly reintroducing and retrying things is huge.
I love that. I was a very picky eater growing up, and my mom always my mom she always used to tell me in a loving, smirking, humorous way. She had a great sense of humor. Not in a reprimanding way, that if I didn't become more experimental with food, that I'd be boring, as an adult. And I never wanted to be boring. So that's how she would get me to try new things like sushi and, more exotic dishes and the like. So.
Yeah, I like that. I know. I tell my oldest is our pickiest. My younger 2 are very adventurous. They try pretty much anything. They don't always like it, but they at least try it. My oldest, I always joke with him, because I'm like, for probably the first like 6 or 7 years of his life, he didn't like chocolate. And I'm like, if you would, and now he loves it, and he'll, ice cream or whatever. And I'm like, if you would have never tried that, you would never have known you liked it, and look at how much you'd be missing out. And I'm like, what if you love this vegetable, or what if you love this dinner, So I like try to kind of equate it to that too. I'm like, how will you know if you like something, or how will you know if you're not missing out on something unless you at least give it a shot? So that's kind of our rule. I'm not like a clean your plate type of mom. I'm like, give it a shot. And then our typical rule for dinner, if it's something new, is like, if they don't like something, if they try it, they don't have to finish it, but they can have more of whatever else I'm serving. I'm not going to go into the kitchen and make them something else. It's like, you can have, if you don't like the meat, but you love the broccoli, you can have a plate of broccoli for dinner. Like that's it. I'm not making a second dinner.
I love that. You're such a good mom. I also think it's such an important lesson, always being willing to challenge the narrative that you have in your head about your your food preferences. I think that's a crucial life, skill to have.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely.
I like things today that I didn't like 2-3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Right. Same. Yep. And things that I tried. Yeah, definitely. I mean, things that I tried that I don't think I would have, ever tried. Yeah. I think we're constantly evolving if we let ourselves.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
If you understand you're also eating to regulate every single biological function in your body, whether it's your gut or your microbiome, your immune system, your detox system, how your energy is made, your hormones, communication systems, your structural system, all that is influenced by every bite of food you take in real time. It's the single most important thing you do every day to control your health, period.